Let's talk about the female reproductive system in here. The anatomy of the reproductive system includes ovaries. These are situated way back in the pelvic wall, held in place by a number of ligaments, and they are not connected to the rest of the reproductive tract. Whereas the rest of the reproductive tract involves the fallopian tube, also called as the oviduct or the uterine tube. The first part of the uterine tube is enlarged and has these finger-like projections called fimbriae. They spread around the ovary in order to receive the oocyte that is released during ovulation. Fallopian tube continues further and joins the uterus. Uterus is a muscular structure, has three parts. Fundus is this bulge, main portion is the body, last part is the narrower cervix, which then continues further as the vagina, which opens to the exterior. The external genitalia includes the clitoris and labia minora, labia majora, and mons pubis is this bulge here. A clitoris is equivalent of penis in having erectile tissue. Okay, with this review, let's get to the main detail, oogenesis, that is the formation of eggs, or ovum is what we really need in order for the sperm to fertilize. Oogenesis begins very early in the female, as early as in the fetal life. All of the egg cells go through mitosis. These egg cells are oogonia. They get converted into primary oocytes while they are within the ovary, within the fetus. So then meiosis begins also. However, meiosis 1 that starts in a primary oocyte suddenly stops at prophase 1, and that is how it remains till it is influenced by new hormones in a new cycle in the adult life. So that is what we still have to see. However, when meiosis is completed, we do not get 4 cells for one stem cell like we saw with the male spermatogenesis, but here one oogonium ends up producing only one ovum. If it reaches that stage, it's one ovum or none. It's not going to be 4 like in spermatogenesis. Second meiosis is only completed in the presence of sperm. So there are lots of these barriers for oogenesis. Let's recap again. Oogenesis begins before birth. All oogonia are converted into primary oocytes. Meiosis 1 begins but is halted at prophase 1. What happens to it in the adult life, we can wait and see. So here is an animation of the same oogonium. You have mitosis changing them to primary oocytes. Meiosis 1 begins, stops at prophase 1. All of this happens before birth. And after puberty, not all egg cells, only a small number of them resume meiosis 1. And that is when meiosis 1 is completed, and here you get 2 uneven size of cells. One of them, the larger one, is called secondary oocyte. The smaller one is called first polar body. secondary oocyte will begin meiosis II. First polar body is where the chromosome numbers are the same as in the secondary oocyte, but the amount of cytoplasm is very little. This may undergo further cell division to become second polar bodies, but they will not survive. So these would eventually die, and so we got rid of this particular set of cells. We are only dealing with secondary oocyte. It was large to begin, and now it begins meiosis II. It gets to as far as metaphase II and stops there. So before sperm penetration, this is how far cell division can go. In the presence of sperm is when the secondary oocyte can resume meiosis II and complete very quickly and result in two cells. One of them is called the ovum. This is called second polar body. The same trick occurs again. One cell gets all of the cytoplasm or most of the cytoplasm. The second cell gets very little, which eventually dies. So the ovum is produced in the presence of sperm. Very soon the nuclear membrane disappears between the sperm nucleus and the nucleus of the ovum. The two sets of chromosomes come together and pair up, and that's what we call as fertilization. We start off with about 4 million oogonia, and at about 8 to 9 weeks of gestation is when mitosis occurs. They become primary oocytes. They begin meiosis I, but meiosis I stops at prophase I. Number of primary oocytes decreases throughout childhood. Note that you only have about 1 to 2 million at the time of birth, to about 400,000 at the time of puberty. What happens to these cells, why do they die, is not known. And the process of losing these cells in such large numbers is what you call as atresia. Primary oocytes, each one of these is surrounded by a layer of cells, and the structure together is called a primordial follicle. Let's talk about puberty and menarche here. Puberty is the beginning of the reproductive life. Menarche is the beginning of the cycle of menstruation. It happens a little earlier in female than in the male. 10 to 16 years of age is when it occurs. It is becoming earlier and earlier than a few decades ago. Factors that affect puberty in a female could be many: genetics, nutrition, geographic location, exposure to light, body composition, fat deposition, exercise. All those matter. As I mentioned, menarche has been occurring earlier in past few decades in here and in Europe. Look at this. Distance from equator, higher altitude, those are the ones that trigger early onset. Let's get back to the reproductive cycle, where we will look at the follicles and other details. Menstrual cycle is controlled by hormones. These hormones include gonadotropins LH and FSH, and gonadal hormones estrogen and progesterone. And don't forget the hypothalamic hormone GnRH that triggers the production of gonadotropins, which in turn trigger the production of the gonadal hormones estrogen and progesterone. We will organize menstrual cycle into two parts: ovarian cycle and endometrial cycle. One is in the ovary, the other one is in the uterus. Ovarian cycle is further organized into three parts: follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. in a normal hypothetical cycle, the cycle is about 28 days. First 14 days in this cycle is referred to as the follicular phase. Day 14, again, hypothetically, should be the day of ovulation. A luteal phase is the second half of the cycle, which goes from 15 to 28 days. Endometrial cycle is also organized into different parts: menstruation phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. Menstruation phase is the first 5 days of the cycle, that is 1 through 5 of a new cycle. Most of you probably think that menstruation occurs at the end of the cycle. Not really. When you think about what is happening in the ovary, luteal phase goes all the way up to 28 days, and the start of the new phase, new cycle, is where you would begin that with menstruation. The shedding of the previous cycle's preparation, and now begin with the new phase, that is proliferative phase, which lasts from 4 to 14 days. Secretory phase is 15 to about 26 days. Let's understand the details of ovarian follicle. You have approximately 4 million follicles to begin with. These are primordial follicles. These numbers fall, as we talked about earlier, and about 400,000 of these is what you see in the ovary in the adulthood, at least in the beginning. Then a handful of these would be affected by LH and FSH in each cycle, and with the influence of these hormones, the primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle. Basically, here is the oocyte. Oocyte could be called as primary oocyte because we know that mitosis occurred in the gestational life. This oocyte is surrounded by a layer of cells called that as granulosa cells. Then there is a thick lining around the oocyte called zona pellucida. So this is the structure of a primary follicle that is in the beginning of a new cycle, and because of the effect of LH and FSH on a few of the primordial follicles. Made of one germ cell is the oocyte, surrounded by endocrine cells, those are granulosa cells. These are the cells that start producing estrogen. Here is a summary of all of the different stages that the follicles go through in each cycle. Primordial follicles are the ones that are always going to be there. If you really wanted to understand the structure of the ovary is organized into cortex and medulla. Cortex is the outer portion, medulla is the deeper portion. Medulla is where you don't have any follicles. Blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves is what you typically find. The cortex is where these follicles are situated. So, in the presence of LH and FSH, you would get primary follicle. About a dozen, say, is what we see go through this cycle. All right. So, primary follicle is bigger, and it gets even more bigger. And this is where you start seeing additional layers of cells, and then these little pockets of fluids appear. And another thing is meiosis 1 is probably continuing at this point. All these changes occur due to the influence of LH, FSH, and estrogen produced by the granulosa cells. By the way, granulosa cells now in multiple layers are organized into theca externa, theca and interna. Those are the layers of cells: outer layer, externa, inner layer, internal. So the follicle is getting bigger, cells are becoming more and more, and meiosis 1 probably is underway. It was stopped in prophase 1, but now we will assume that meiosis one has moved from prophase 1 to metaphase, anaphase, and whatnot. All right. So now let's talk about tertiary follicle, which is also called as a graphene follicle or mature follicle. In here, what you see is the increased layers of cells, theca externa, theca interna, nicely organized. Oocyte is pushed to one end of the cell, one end of the follicle, and then the fluid compartments, the little ones, are all fused to become a really big fluid-filled space referred to as antrum. Oocyte is here. What we really have to assume here is that meiosis 1 has been completed. It is now called secondary oocyte. The polar body that would have been formed but probably has disappeared at this point. All we have to remember is the oocyte at this point is going to be secondary oocyte, and that has this zona pellucida around it and a layer of granulosa cells around it. Those around the oocyte, over the oocyte, is what you call as corona radiata, crown over the oocyte. So this is a follicle. This is a tertiary follicle. Here is the secondary oocyte. All of these are pushed to the very end of the cortex, that is like almost against the wall of the ovary. In fact, if you were looking under the microscope, you would see a bulge. If this is the wall of the ovary, this is the tertiary follicle, it is like pushing against the wall, and there would be a nice swelling outside that you will see. The wall ultimately becomes thinner, and what happens is the follicle bursts open, and this is what is happening here. Ovulating follicle, the wall is ruptured, the ruptured follicle, and you release the oocyte with the layer of granulosa cells and the zona pellucida to the outside. And we have to assume that the ampulla of the fallopian tube would have caught that. So it would move into the fallopian tube. So that is the phase we refer to as ovulation. Day 14 is when it happens. And this is the follicle that is ruptured, and it soon assumes a new form. It recovers quickly, and the follicle without the oocyte that has just recovered is what you call as corpus luteum. Corpus luteum now becomes a new endocrine structure within the ovary and starts producing two hormones, estrogens and progesterone. Please note that there is a large amount of progesterone compared to estrogen. Follicle, before ovulation, was able to produce estrogen. As the follicle got bigger and bigger, it produced more and more estrogen. No progesterone at that point. However, after ovulation, the follicle begins to produce not only estrogen but a lot of progesterone. This continues for a while. Corpus luteum gets bigger and produces more estrogen and more progesterone, say until about day 25, day 26. It's looking for signals of pregnancy, and when there is no signal about pregnancy, makes corpus luteum assume that there is no pregnancy, and it stops producing these hormones and shrink in size. And the shrinking corpus luteum is what we call as corpus albicans. Corpus albicans is a smaller structure that remains there in the ovary for about 2 or 3 months. It gradually regresses in size and disappears on its own. Corpus luteum is the one that secretes estrogen and progesterone That is the one that's needed in the implantation of fertilized egg. If there was pregnancy, then its anatomy is explained here. 80% granulosa cells, 20% thecal cells. If there is no fertilization, it regresses in about 14 days. Avascular scar is what we call as corpus albicans. Let's talk about the uterus and the uterine cycle or the endometrial cycle now. The details of the uterus are shown here, the fundus, the body, and the cervix. The wall of the uterus is important for us to talk about a bit. The wall is shown here. Perimetrium is the outermost layer. Most of it is myometrium, that's shown here. Endometrium in here. Endometrium could be organized into two sublayers. Stratum basalis here, stratum functionalis, that is open to the uterine cavity. Basalis is holding on to the rest of the wall. Functionalis is the one that goes through cyclic changes, that is being very thin in the beginning of the cycle and becoming really thicker and filled with secretions, glands, blood vessels closer to the end of the cycle. And that is functionalis. So with this detail, we'll look at the layers that are mentioned here: perimetrium, myometrium, endometrium, stratum basalis, and stratum functionalis are the two layers of the endometrium. You're looking at primordial follicle becoming primary follicles and eventually secondary follicles. So days 1 through 7 is follicular phase. You may not have reached the secondary follicle at that point. Atresia is the last of this follicle. Only one of the dozen or so were targeted is allowed to survive. So you're looking at one secondary follicle that has been allowed to survive, and then that becomes tertiary follicle. Okay? So rest of them disintegrate. So single selected tertiary follicle is shown in here. This is allowed to grow further, and that is the one that goes through ovulation. We saw ovulation earlier. This happens on day 14. And we talked about corpus luteum being formed, and now corpus albicans, that is the regressing corpus luteum, and this is degrading corpus luteum again, so day 28. In the ovary, you have three phases: follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. They're shown here, correct? Now, let's talk about the uterine cycle. First 7 days is what you call as menses. Proliferative phase, there is a little bit of overlap between menses and the proliferative phase. You could say proliferative phase is where the layer is reconstructed, so thickness begins to increase. And secretory phase is where the thickness gets even bigger. That is because glands are becoming active and blood vessels are growing into this newly added tissue. So menstruation is where you remove the previously added layer. Okay, so thickness is shown to be decreasing. Typically it occurs in the first 5 days. To be on the safe side, we have stretched it to 7 days. And proliferative phase is where the new stratum functionalis layer is being added, and secretory phase is when it's able to produce nutrients and other substances to help the implantation of the fertilized structure. At the time it arrives in the uterine wall, it would be called blastula. And it has to implant and depend on the nutrients that are in here until a placenta is in place. Okay? If no pregnancy, then this layer will wilt and then will be removed in the next cycle. So this is the regressing layer. What happens is up to about day 25, day 26, you're anticipating pregnancy, and by then you know that there is no pregnancy and there is no estrogen and progesterone. If you remember, corpus luteum, as it realizes that there is no pregnancy, stops producing these hormones. Without the hormones, the blood vessels begin to die as well as the tissue, and this is the dying tissue, the thickness is decreasing. Now, let's connect these two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, to the cycles of hormones. These are pituitary hormones you're looking at. Then we will talk about the ovarian hormones. Pituitary hormones, LH and FSH, their levels are low to start with. With increasing estrogen, what happens is it sends a positive feedback signal. This is a very unique situation, a positive feedback signal that is sent to the pituitary or into the hypothalamus and then the pituitary. It results in an increasing FSH and increasing LH levels. This is what you call as FSH surge, LH surge that occurs right before ovulation. You call that as pre-ovulatory LH surge, pre-ovulatory FSH surge. This is totally different from all other mechanisms you have been introduced. Increasing estrogen levels would turn on the hypothalamus to produce more GnRH, which in turn triggers the production of more FSH and more LH, and that is going to cause a stimulus to produce more estrogen, which we will look at in the new cycle, in the new place here, that is here. So this surge occurs, and that's what is needed for ovulation. The surge of FSH, the surge of LH, the surge of estrogen, all three are needed in ovulation. As soon as ovulation is over, the levels of these hormones decrease suddenly. So that's what is shown in here. And they remain low until the end of this cycle. At the very end of the cycle, you know that estrogen and progesterone levels dip down. That would be a new trigger for the production of new GnRH, and that starts a new cycle all over again. So this discussion won't be complete until we add the ovarian hormonal cycle into this discussion. So estrogen levels are shown here in blue, and they are very low to start with in this cycle. If you notice here, from 0 to about 3 days, it's like nothing. And as you see, the primary follicle are about to be formed. They begin to assume endocrine function. That's what causes an increase in estrogen levels. These levels are raising, and they are the ones that trigger the LH and FSH. So increasing LH and FSH increase the production of estrogen, increasing LH and FSH increase estrogen. So that is how you see a steady increase in estrogen levels, and this is what you call as estrogen surge, pre-ovulatory estrogen surge. Highest level of estrogen that you could find is probably around day 12 and day 13. This woman at this point is really hypo. A superwoman is how you would see a woman's behavior. All right, so that is all required for ovulation and trigger ovulation, and that happens on day 14. A rupture of the graphene follicle dips the levels down for estrogen. And now we need to know that this follicle is converted into corpus luteum, which then starts making two hormones, that is progesterone and estrogen. A lot of progesterone compared to estrogen. So these two are in dominance in the luteal phase, that is to prepare the uterus for possible pregnancy. Progesterone is a pregnancy hormone. So that is how it is, and if there is no pregnancy, these hormone levels dip down, and that would be the trigger for the beginning of a new cycle. The uterine lining is going to shrink, and GnRH levels will begin to climb, and then the new cycle of pituitary hormones, new cycle of ovarian hormones, everything has to start all over again. So that is a lot of detail for this slide. So the same thing is summarized in some of these slides. Three hierarchies of hormones: hypothalamic GnRH, anterior LH, and FSH, in response to increasing GnRH, which then trigger the production of ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. The hormone situation is all shown in different phases here. Follicular phase is where GnRH triggers the anti-pituitary to produce LH and FSH. FSH targets follicles to grow, and granulosa cells are the ones LH targets, and that is how estrogen is produced. And estrogen also targets the endometrium to assume the proliferation of stratum functionalis. During ovulation, this is what's happening. Pituitary hormone effect, LH and FSH stimulate maturation of one of the growing follicles. Notice here, there is LH and FSH, high levels of LH and FSH on the follicles, and they secrete more estrogen and more hypothalamic GnRH, more pituitary hormone. So this is a positive feedback effect that triggers the surge of these hormones we talked about earlier, and then the proliferation of uterus through the effect of estrogen. So after that, we have the luteal phase. At this point, LH and FSH target corpus luteum, as estrogen and progesterone are produced by the corpus luteum. They take this signal to the pituitary and hypothalamus to turn off the production of their specific hormones. So it is a normal negative feedback effect. So there is suppressed LH, suppressed FSH, suppressed GnRH level in the second half of the cycle. Both progesterone and estrogen trigger the uterus to make it become very secretory, meaning more glands, more blood vessels, very rich in the secretion from stratum functionalis. Okay, functions of estrogen. Okay, estradiol is a major estrogen. There are other types of estrogens called estrone and estradiol beta is the big one. Estrone, estriol are the other two in smaller amounts. So estrogen is important in the fat deposition, more fat in a female than in a male, and that's interesting, correct? And then the distribution of fat is different in the female before menopause, that is mostly in the hips and the thighs, and then after menopause, the deposition of fat is more in the abdomen, just like in the male. In the male, deposition of fat is mainly in the abdomen, not in the thighs and the buttocks. And in the skin, there is increased vascularization. Bone function is also stimulated by estrogen. Okay, inhibits osteoclastic activity and more production of bone, increased deposition of bone matrix, and the growth of the bone length around the age of puberty. All of that is due to estrogen. All right, more functions to add: increasing the size of the accessory structures, maintenance of the functions of external genitalia, vaginal epithelia change even within the cycle, endometrial changes we saw earlier in the presence of estrogen. Breasts are also under the influence of estrogen. They grow bigger, more fat, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about contraception in the female. A variety of methods. Rhythm method is where you monitor the cycle, avoid sex during the window of time where ovulation occurs. This method can go wrong and not a reliable method. Oral contraceptives, patch contraceptives, involve a combination of a small amount of estrogen, combination of progesterone. So that is typically how it is. So the combination of LH and FSH would prevent the surge of FSH and surge of LH that we see prior to ovulation. Combination of LH and progesterone prevent the surge of FSH and LH. Without the surge, there is no ovulation. Without the ovulation, there is no fertilization. Implant contraceptives, there are a variety of those. Narplant, you may have heard of. This would be good for 5 years. Narprogestins is what you find in here. Depo-Provera is another type of implantation that could be inserted in the skin, and that would be 3-month type of hormonal protection. Again, inhibits ovulation and therefore implantation. Intrauterine devices are very popular. They are implanted into the uterus, so the body assumes that there is fetus already, and so prevents the implantation. The strange thing here is the oocyte is fertilized, and the fertilized structure is what is arriving in the uterus, but it cannot be implanted, so no pregnancy. Barrier methods using condom or a diaphragm with spermicidal jelly, etc. A variety of these can be found. Postcoital contraceptives. So here, having sex and then perhaps pregnancy would occur, knowing that it was unprotected sex. RU486 is one of those, and Plan B is where you have morning after pill, that is progestin used within 72 hours of unprotected intercourse. Tubal ligation is where the fallopian tube is ligated and the two ends are tied so that there is no oocyte for the sperm to meet and no fertilization. Menopause, you're coming to the end of the reproductive age here. In the female, there is a window of year 13, 14 to about 50 years. That is what you call as reproductive years. The follicles that are in the ovaries are dropping in numbers continuously. We started off with about 400,000 at the time of puberty. By the time a woman reaches the age of menopause, there is 0. Some of them were targeted in each cycle, and one was allowed to survive and ovulate, and that could happen to about 400 or so follicles. The rest of them are all degenerated. So, aging of the ovaries, okay, no estrogen production because there are no follicles to produce estrogen. Fewer primary follicles left, and it occurs around the age of 50 due to reduction in estrogen. Oh, we didn't talk about inhibin. Inhibin is another hormone secreted by the follicles. That is the one that is able to remove follicles that are growing to become secondary follicles. When only one of them is allowed to survive, other follicles that we hold back are destroyed by hormone inhibin. So without estrogen, there is no positive feedback of LH and FSH, no surge of LH, FSH. And in fact, because there is less estrogen, there is high level of LH and FSH in order to promote the production of estrogen, but that doesn't happen because there is no follicle to target, no estrogen to be produced by this follicle that doesn't exist. So can occur naturally due to surgery, due to chemotherapy,